Chapter 5. Happy Homecoming. 1,000 flatterers sit within thy crown. Shakespeare, King Richard II. Act 2, Scene 1, Verse 100. He left a chaperone boy and returned a dashing debonair man, dressed in a trim and tailored suit, his dark curly hair perfectly coiffed. He went in docility with an entourage hand-picked by his father. He returned in quiet defiance in the company of a friend he had chosen himself, and who he knew would not meet with the approval of his father. No less dramatic were the changes that had taken place in Iran in the 5 years of his absence. Reza Shah's far-reaching reforms touched nearly every facet of Iranian life. From the disparate parts of a country on the verge of collapse, what in today's social science terminology would be called a failed state, Reza Shah had created a modern nation, with a strong central government, a small and budding industrial sector, and a modern but brittle army and bureaucracy. About the time of the Crown Prince's return, Iran was set to finish a transitional railroad. Reza Shah had ordered it built in spite of domestic and international opposition. Britain initially tried to dissuade him from the idea altogether. When it found that he would not be deterred, the British government tried to convince him to build it along an east-west axis, connecting Turkey and Europe to Pakistan and India. Reza Shah opted instead for a plan that connected the Persian Gulf to the Caspian Sea. Although the Crown Prince was out of Iran when work on the railroad began, he was, unbeknownst to himself, entangled in some of the controversies surrounding the project. Reza Shah was unhappy that the trestles used in building the tracks were all imported from the Soviet Union. In response to his concern, a small group of politicians and businessmen created a company called Shirkate-e Jangalat Forest Company that used Iranian lumber to make the trestles. To facilitate their work, they named the Crown Prince as a partner in the company. Soon, Reza Shah learned that the company had been greedily razing some of the beautiful forest and ancient trees of his beloved province of Mazandaran. He angrily ordered the company closed and its properties confiscated. There is no evidence that Prince Mohammed Reza in Switzerland at the time knew anything about his own ghost partnership in the company. But during his own reign, the practice of giving partnership to members of the royal family to facilitate work became a common practice and occasionally a major headache for him and his regime. Reza Shah had also opened Iran's historic sites, including religious centers and schools, for inspection and study by American and European scholars and anthropologists. Arthur Pope and André Goddard were two of the most important such experts. Many of the mosques discussed and displayed in books on Iranian art history were for the first time opened to non-Muslims under the direct order of Reza Shah. The future Shah would continue his father's fervent patronage of both Goddard and Pope, as well as other Western archaeologists and art historians. Pope's monumental study of Persian art was one of the fruits of his patronage. On May 13, 1928, Reza Shah unilaterally declared null and void all existing capitulary rights, a despised vestige of colonialism by which citizens of the colonial country were granted immunity from prosecution in Iranian courts. The decision was rightly celebrated with much fanfare as a sign of Iran's newfound independence. But the end of capitulary rights also signaled a change in the nature of Iran's relationship with the outside world, increasing tension with Britain. Reza Shah's first major confrontation with the British came soon after his 1926 coronation. The Iranian foreign minister had written a categorical note to the British embassy demanding the removal of Indian sailors, mounted guards from Persia. The British had been using such guards in some of their consular offices. In those days, Harold Nicholson, husband to Vida Sackville-West, and the man who, in his own words, had a Kipling inside him and something of an empire builder, was Britain's charge d'affaires in Iran. He rushed to the Iranian Foreign Ministry to object. Only the armed forces of the Imperial Army of Iran, the Iranian note said, are now permitted to carry arms in Iran. The note was, in the opinion of Nicholson, so categorical as to be almost offensive. He wanted Iran to take back or change the note. Much to his displeasure, the Foreign Ministry informed Nicholson that the disputed note had been imposed upon the ministry by none other than Reza Shah, and thus could, under no circumstances, be taken back or amended. Eventually, a solution was found, adding an annex to the text, softening the tone of the initial note. But at the end, the British were forced to abide by the content of what diplomats would call the frank and honest letter. A number of other issues, large and small, continued to come up between Reza Shah and the British government, causing an almost chronic rift between the two. There was, for example, the time when representatives from the British embassy tried to visit Sheikh Khazal in Tehran, where he was under house arrest, but were told they must go through normal channels required for visiting prisoners. In the Basido incident, the British decided to fly their own flag over the small settlement of one of the Iranian islands in the Persian Gulf that they had been using as a coaling station for their ships. The Iranian government ordered, and the British government agreed to take down their flag and instead fly a Persian flag. By then, the British were already becoming increasingly agitated by Reza Shah's recalcitrance. In fact, on the day of the Crown Prince's return to Iran, there was another minor altercation between Iran and Britain when British sailors tried to land on Iranian soil without receiving the requisite permission or answering the normal queries of Iranian customs officials. The most controversial confrontation between Reza Shah and British took place, as expected, over oil. In April 1933, after prolonged and contentious negotiations, in one instance, Reza Shah angrily tore to pieces the text of the Darcy concession initially signed in 1900 that had given Britain a monopoly on Persian oil, and after the issue was taken up by the League of Nations, a new agreement was eventually signed, known as the 1933 Agreement. Reza Shah and his supporters declared it a great victory for Iran. Many years later, one aspect of these negotiations would become the subject of some debate. In the language of Article 10 of the agreement, it was clearly stipulated that Iran should have 20% of the profits not only of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in Iran, but of all its subsidiaries around the world. After a few years, the company had in fact spawned dozens of extremely profitable subsidiaries, and Iran's share amounted to millions of dollars. The British fought hard not to pay any such royalties, and when Iran's oil industry was nationalized in 1951, Article 10, along with everything else in the 1933 agreement, was declared null and void. There were, at the time, experts who argued that, in the long run, Iran's revenues from these subsidiary rights would be greater than new revenues resulting from the nationalization of the country's oil industry. But of Reza Shah's reforms, the one that most directly affected his son's political future was the plan to secularize the Iranian polity and limit the influence of the Shiite clergy. The clergy's main source of economic power and social status had until then been their control over the judiciary and education systems. A third source of their income had been their role as executors of vast religious endowments. Vakf. Reza Shah disenfranchised the clergy by depriving them of the revenues they historically received from the Vakf and from running both the judiciary and education system. The start of a modern university and the establishment of a secular law school were serious blows to the power of the clergy. Limiting their roles in these areas meant a radical curtailment of the clergy's ideological, economic, and political power. The policy left a lingering sense of betrayal in at least some of the clergy. Ironically, while the Shah changed this aspect of his father's policy and attempted a rapprochement with the clergy, he ended up paying the price for the clergy's seething anger. Reza Shah's confrontation with the clergy reached its zenith in mid-July 1935 in the city of Mashhad, where the shrine of Shiism's 8th Imam Reza is located. Reza Shah's confrontation with the clergy reached its zenith in mid-July 1935 in the city of Mashhad, where the shrine of Shiism's 8th Imam Reza is located. Footnote. Of the 12 Imams revered by the version of Shiism dominant in Iran, Esna Azrari, or Twelvers, only one, Reza is buried in Iran. His sister is buried in the city of Qom, but the Iranian landscape is also strewn with an estimated 100,000 Imamzadeh, big and small shrines, all claiming to be the burial site of some descendant of the Imam, or of a Imam. Though it is all but impossible to substantiate these claims of divinity, the shrines invariably satisfy the devotional needs of the truly devout. End of footnote. A few weeks before the confrontation, Reza Shah had ordered a ban on traditional forms of Shiite mourning, particularly self-flagellation and self-mutilation, in which mournful mourners beat their backs with chains or their foreheads with machetes. Also banned were ta'aziyeh, a traditional form of Shiite passion play that mourns the martyrdom of Shiism's third Imam, Hussein, in the Battle of Karbala. To Reza Shah and his cultural advisors, ta'aziyeh was nothing but an emblem of reactionary tradition. The 1935 ban did not take place in a social vacuum. This was an era when similar ideas were being advocated by many Iranian thinkers and secular intellectuals. Even a large number of Shiite writers and theologians had also begun promoting a new form of Shiism, rational in vision, bereft of superstitions, tokens, amulets, and self-mutilation, and free from the grim cult of grief as a sign of piety and guarantor of salvation. Moreover, in a pattern that echoed one of the demands of the Protestant Reformation in Europe, these Shiite reformers also wanted a faith free from the domination of the traditional clergy. One young reformist named Ali Akbar Hakamizadeh launched a journey called Homayon in January 1935 and published 10 issues. Each one had exactly 32 pages. Aside from iconoclastic articles on Shiism, contained articles on hygiene and at least one entertainment piece. Hakamizadeh also published a book in 1934 called Asrar Hazar Selah, or Thousand-Year-Old Mysteries, in which he advocated a Shiism without the obscurantism of the clergy and a polity guided by the rule of law and reason. It was a measure of the power of these reformant ideas, and the Hakamizadeh's book, that Ayatollah Khomeini's first published book, was an angry polemic against them. He called the proponents of these ideas infidels and corrupters of the earth, a concept that came back into bloody vogue in the days and months after the Islamic Revolution of 1979, and asked for their execution. Ayatollah Khomeini not only defended the rituals of mourning, but argued that the rituals and the tears of the pious, and most important of all, the presence and power of Shiite clergy, are in fact the true pillars of Shiism and the key to its survival. In the 60s and 70s, when ideas critical of the clergy were once again in vogue, it was Ayatollah Khomeini, more than anyone else, who rose to suppress these ideas and defend the role of the clergy in preserving his beloved Islam. But Reza Shah's most contentious orders had to do with how men and women appeared in public. In Iran, as in other countries, sartorial changes are often one of the earliest signs and most sensitive barometers of social change and of the transition from tradition to modernity. The first controversial order banned the traditional headgear worn by most Persian men, requiring everyone to wear, instead a new modern hat, invariably called a Pahlavi hat. The clergy, pinning for confrontation with Reza Shah and anticipating more pressure from him in the future, challenged the order. Some ayatollahs issued fatwas, religious decrees, against the new hats and against the emergent fashion of neckties, arguing that they represented surrogate crosses. On July 17, 1935, protesters in the city of Mashhad took to the streets and then, chased by the police, took refuge in Imam Reza's shrine. For many centuries, mosques and shrines had been considered sanctuaries, safe havens, free from the reach of the government. Reza Shah defied the tradition, ordering the army to attack the demonstrators. Scores of protesters were killed. Casualty figures range from 60 to several thousand. Footnote: a common error of many historical narratives of the period is the assumption that the big Mashhad confrontation was over the issue of women's headgear. End of footnote. Ayatollah Hussein Gomi, then one of Iran's top Shiite clerics, left Mashhad in protest. He had been to that point a supporter of Reza Shah, publicly declaring that Iran's glories were all due to Reza Shah. He came to Tehran hoping to visit with Reza Shah and register his strong protest over the shrine episode. But to his dismay, Reza Shah refused a meeting. As a gesture of protest, the Ayatollah left the country, but his voluntary exile lasted only 6 years. No sooner had Reza Shah abdicated than his son, in a major reversal of policy and attitude, invited the Ayatollah back to Iran in 1941. His return was to have far-reaching ramifications for Iran and for the new Shah. On January 7, 1936, Reza Shah issued another order, this one even more controversial, decreeing that Iranian women would henceforth only be allowed in public shorn of their traditional veils. From the time of the Constitutional Revolution, 1905 to 1907, a number of autonomous women's groups had appeared throughout the country. The Bolshevik Revolution, too, had a profound influence on Iranian women. Beginning in 1926, a number of women, many of them living in Tehran, had begun to test the limits of their freedom by appearing in public wearing only a hat rather than the traditional veil. The government and the police implicitly protected these women from the wrath of the more pious citizens. In 1934, a conference was held to celebrate the life and work of the poet Ferdowsi in the city of Tuz, not far from the city of Meshed, long a Shiite stronghold. In the course of the conference, a few women appeared without a veil, and the clergy, though angry, chose to do nothing. Despite these early hints of change, Reza Shah's order created something of a shock amongst the more traditional sectors of Iranian society. Even today, more than half a century after that decision, many secular Iranians, as well as advocates of women's rights, have rejected Reza Shah's order as an act of brazen despotism. He dictated by royal fiat, they say, and overlook the fact that social transformations can only come through a gradual, endogenous process of change. The clergy once again spared no effort to fight the new decree. But then Reza Shah had such a strong grip on power that religious forces could do little but accept defeat. They would bide their time, and only when Reza Shah was off the throne would they resume their effort to turn back the clock and bring back the veil, or at least the right of Muslim women to wear it in public. Reza Shah believed that his strong-arm tactics were the indispensable tools for fostering modernity and fighting stubborn forces of tradition. But this tempting dialectic of despotism and development turned out to be a vicious circle, self-generating and self-fulfilling in the short run, and self-negating and self-destructive in the long run. He needed an iron hand. Reza Shah claimed if he was to make changes in an otherwise ossified social structure, the more changes he made in that structure, the more convinced he became that his iron hand had been the panacea. In 1936, when the teenage Mohammad Reza returned from his European sojourn, he remained simply a passive and docile observer of his father's iron hand, and the changes it forced not just on the body politic, but on his life and that of other members of the royal family. Less than a month after his return home, his twin sister, Princess Ashraf, asked him in desperation to intercede on her behalf and convince Reza Shah to change his mind about the marriages he had planned for her and her older sister, Princess Shams. Among the royal family, the only person who dared challenge the decisions of Reza Shah was the Queen Mother. It was a source of great amusement in the royal family that the man whose gaze brought terror to the hearts of ministers and military men went into hiding when he saw the Queen Mother coming. All through her life, her relationship with her estranged husband, Reza Shah, and his fear of her, as well as his mode and manner of intimacy with her, was a favorite subject of joking banter between her and Mohammad Reza Shah. "How did you fall in love?" the Shah asked his octogenarian mother at a court dinner in April 1976. "How often did you sleep together?" A giggling Queen Mother answered that most of the time we spent together we were not on speaking terms, but she clearly enjoyed the light banter. It was 1936, however. She was not willing to come to her daughter's aid. Neither was the Crown Prince. Princess Ashraf was nearly 17 years old when Reza Shah decided that she and her 18-year-old sister, Princess Shams, must be married. Unbeknownst to them both, he had asked Prime Minister Mohammad Jam to prepare a list accompanied by photos of young men from prominent Iranian families in the country who were eligible to marry the Shah's two daughters. In compiling the list, Jam also decided to include the name and a picture of his own son, Feryadun. In those days, a lieutenant registered in France's storied St. Cyr Military Academy. In the elaborately embroidered uniform of the French St. Cyr officer, he cut a dashing figure, and Reza Shah was immediately impressed. He chose him for Princess Ashraf and picked Ali Kavem, the scion of the famous Anglophile family from the city of Shiraz, for Princess Shams. While engaged in this matchmaking frenzy, he also decided that Kavem's daughter, Taj, should marry Asadullah Alam, the son of the Alam family that had been prominent in the Khorasan province of Iran for several hundred years. The engagements were announced on October 1st, 1936. No sooner had Princess Shams laid eyes on Jem than she decided she preferred him over Ali, the man her father had picked as her designated husband. The ever-petulant and spoiled favorite daughter, who invariably got what she wanted, prevailed yet again, and when the official announcement was made, she was set to wed Jem. Princess Ashraf had no choice but to resign herself to a forced marriage to Ali Kavem. Before long, Reza Shah decided that the crown prince, too, needed to find a wife and future queen. All of these changes in the court took place in the context of a world that was also radically changing. The specter of Nazism haunted from just Europe and Asia, Africa, and America. Iran was not spared. Hitler had his eyes on the oil fields of Iran and the Persian Gulf, and he spared no effort in trying to appeal to the people and governments of the area. The fact that his harangues were often targeted against the British and Soviet menace, the two colonial foes of Persia, made the Nazis' sinister work easier. The appeal of Germany was as the supporter of a third way. Neither British nor Russian preceded the rise of Nazism, and first appeared in Iran during the time of the First World War. In the 30s, the Nazi propaganda machine in Iran was well oiled. One of the earliest signs of this Nazi intellectual onslaught was the publication of a magazine called Iran, a Bastion, Ancient Iran.